The woman standing on Kieran Holloway's porch in the golden light of the Texas afternoon was not the bride he had been expecting, and one glance at her pale, terrified face told him she knew it too. Kieran had been wiping down his saddle when he heard the wagon approach, and he'd walked around from the barn expecting to see Martha Whitfield, the sturdy farmer's daughter from Missouri, whose letters had filled his evenings for the past 8 months. Instead, he found himself staring at a slender young woman with dark auburn hair escaping from beneath a dusty bonnet, her traveling dress wrinkled and stained from what must have been weeks on the road. Her eyes were the color of spring grass, wide and uncertain as they met his. "You must be Kieran Holloway," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The wagon driver who had brought her was already turning his horses around, clearly eager to be on his way back to Johnson City before nightfall. "I am," Kieran replied slowly, removing his hat. He was a tall man of 26 years, with dark hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of honest work. "And you are Molly Chambers." She swallowed hard, her gloved hands twisting together. "I know this is not what you were expecting. I know you wrote to Martha Whitfield, and I know she promised to come here and marry you." Kieran felt something cold settle in his chest. "Where is Martha?" Molly's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back with visible effort. "She married someone else, a banker's son in St. Louis. She was my employer, you see. I was her lady's maid. 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave for Texas, she told me she had changed her mind. But she had already accepted your money for the journey, and she knew you were expecting a bride." The pieces were falling into place now, though Kieran could scarcely believe what he was hearing. "So she sent you in her place. She said it did not matter which woman came, that you just needed a wife to help run your ranch." Molly's voice was stronger now, though her cheeks burned with shame. "She said I should be grateful for the opportunity. I am 22 years old, Mr. Holloway, and I have no family left in this world. My parents died of fever 3 years ago. I have been working as a maid ever since, and the truth is, I had nowhere else to go. But I understand if you want to send me away. I have a little money saved. I can find work in town, perhaps." Kieran stood there on his own porch, his mind racing. He had built this ranch from nothing over the past 5 years, carving out a life for himself in the rolling hills outside Johnson City. The year was 1878, and Texas was no longer the wild frontier it had been a decade before, but it was still a hard land that demanded hard work. He had wanted a wife not just for companionship, though he would not deny the loneliness of his evenings, but because he needed help. The ranch was growing, and there was more work than one man could handle alone. He looked at Molly Chambers, really looked at her. She was thin, probably from not eating enough, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and worry. But there was something in the set of her jaw that suggested strength, and her gaze, though uncertain, met his directly. She had traveled all the way from Missouri based on a lie, knowing she was walking into a situation where she might be rejected and cast out. That took courage. "Can you cook?" he asked. Molly blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. I can cook and clean and mend. I can tend a garden and preserve food for winter. I can manage household accounts. Martha Whitfield taught me very little, but my mother taught me how to run a home before she died. Can you ride a horse?" "I have never tried, but I am willing to learn." Kieran made his decision in that moment, though later he would wonder what instinct had guided him. Perhaps it was the honesty in her eyes, or perhaps it was simply that he understood what it meant to have nowhere else to go. He had been 17 when he left his father's failing farm in Tennessee, determined to make something of himself. He knew what desperation looked like. "The preacher in Johnson City comes through once a month," he said. "He was here last week. which means he will not be back for 3 more. But there is a justice of the peace in town who can marry us legally. If you are willing, Miss Chambers, we can ride into Johnson City tomorrow morning and make this arrangement official. I will not lie to you about what life here will be like. The work is hard, and the days are long. But you will have a home, and you will have my protection and my respect. I am not a rich man, but I provide well enough. What do you say?" Molly stared at him, and Kieran could see the war playing out behind her eyes. This was not how a woman was supposed to find a husband. There had been no courtship, no romance, no time to even determine if they could stand each other's company. But the alternative was to return to a life of servitude, always at the mercy of employers who might be kind or cruel, never having anything of her own. "I say yes," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I will do my best to be a good wife to you." "Kieran," he corrected. "If we are to be married, you should call me Kieran." "Kieran," she repeated, and the smallest hint of a smile touched her lips. "Then you must call me Molly." He showed her inside the ranch house, which was modest but sturdy. He had built it himself with help from his neighbors, and while it was not fancy, it was well made. There were 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a good iron stove, and a main room with a fireplace. The furniture was simple but functional. Molly looked around with what seemed like approval. "You keep it clean," she observed. "I try. But I confess the cooking has been getting monotonous. I can manage beans and bacon and not much else." That earned him another small smile. Then perhaps I can be useful after all. Kieran carried her trunk in from where the wagon driver had left it on the porch. "You can take the bedroom on the right," he said. "I will sleep in the other one. We can sort out other arrangements after we are married if you are comfortable with that." Molly's cheeks colored, but she nodded. "That is very considerate of you." That evening, Molly insisted on cooking supper despite her obvious exhaustion. Kieran tried to protest, but she was adamant, and he had to admit that the rabbit stew she produced from his meager supplies was far better than anything he had made for himself in months. They ate in somewhat awkward silence, neither quite sure what to say to the other. "Tell me about the ranch," Molly said finally, setting down her spoon. "How long have you been here?" Kieran was grateful for the question. 5 years this summer. I came to Texas with money I had saved working on the railroads. I wanted land of my own, a place where I could build something that would last. I started with 50 acres and 24 head of cattle. Now I have 200 acres and a herd of nearly 100. It is not a huge operation, but it is mine. That must have taken tremendous work. It did. It does. The cattle need tending year-round. There is always fence to be mended, hay to be cut, water sources to maintain. In the spring, we drive the cattle to market in Fort Worth. That is where the real money comes from. "We," Molly asked, "my neighbors and I." "There are 4 other ranchers within riding distance. We help each other when needed. Good people for the most part. They will want to meet you." Molly looked down at her hands. "What will you tell them about me?" Kieran considered this. "I will tell them the truth. That Martha Whitfield sent you in her place, and that I chose to marry you anyway. I will not have our marriage start with a lie, Molly. These people will be our friends and our community. They deserve honesty, and so do you." The relief on her face was palpable. "I was afraid you would want to pretend I was Martha. I have no use for pretense. You are Molly Chambers, and soon you will be Molly Holloway. That is enough for me." They rode into Johnson City the next morning, Kieran on his sturdy bay gelding and Molly on the gentler mare he kept for occasional use. She had been nervous about riding, but she proved a quick learner, and by the time they reached town, she was managing well enough. Johnson City was a small but growing community with a main street that boasted a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, and various other establishments. The justice of the peace, a balding man named Samuel Wright, seemed unsurprised by their request. "We get a fair number of mail-order brides through here," he said, preparing the paperwork. "Not always the smoothest arrangements, but they usually work out in the end. Do you both enter into this marriage of your own free will?" "We do," Kieran and Molly said in unison. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Kieran had purchased a simple gold band from the general store that morning, and he slipped it onto Molly's finger with steady hands. When Samuel Wright pronounced them married and told Kieran he could kiss his bride, Kieran hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Molly's cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his lips, and he caught the faint scent of lavender. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Holloway," Samuel said, handing Kieran the marriage certificate. "May you have a long and happy life together." As they left the office, Kieran noticed Molly touching the ring on her finger with a kind of wonder. "I never thought I would have a wedding ring," she said softly. "It is not much," Kieran said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "It is everything," Molly replied, and the sincerity in her voice made his chest tighten. They stopped at the general store so Molly could purchase some fabric and thread to make new curtains for the house, and some seeds for a vegetable garden. Kieran watched as she carefully counted out her coins, and he gently pushed her hand away when she went to pay. "You are my wife now," he said. "I will provide for you." "I have my own money," Molly protested. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden. You are my partner. But if it makes you feel better, keep your money for yourself. You should have something of your own." The gratitude in her eyes was almost overwhelming. They loaded their purchases onto the horses and began the ride back to the ranch. The Texas sun was warm on their shoulders, and the spring wildflowers were blooming across the hills in waves of blue and yellow. "It is beautiful here," Molly said, looking around. "So different from Missouri. Everything is so open. Does it frighten you, the openness?" "No," she said after a moment's thought. "It feels like possibility." Over the following weeks, Kieran and Molly settled into a routine. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast, and he found himself looking forward to the smell of fresh coffee and biscuits instead of the burned offerings he had been making for himself. She tackled the house with determination, scrubbing and organizing until everything gleamed. She planted her garden, working in the soil with her skirts pinned up and her sleeves rolled high, and Kieran found himself pausing in his work to watch her. She was nothing like what he had expected Martha Whitfield to be. Martha's letters had been practical and forthright, full of information about her farming background and her capabilities. There had been no poetry in them, no warmth. Molly, on the other hand, had a quiet grace that manifested in unexpected ways. She sang softly while she worked, old songs that Kieran half remembered from his childhood. She left wildflowers in jars on the kitchen table. She laughed at his terrible jokes. Kieran taught her to ride properly, and to his surprise, she took to it with enthusiasm. She was fearless in a way he had not expected, willing to try anything he suggested. When he showed her how to rope a fence post, she practiced until her hands were raw. When he explained the intricacies of cattle breeding, she listened with genuine interest and asked intelligent questions. They talked in the evenings after supper, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the hills. Kieran told her about his childhood in Tennessee, about his father's bitterness over the war and the farm that had never recovered. Molly told him about growing up in a small town in Missouri, about her father who had been a schoolteacher and her mother who had made the best apple pies in 3 counties. "I miss them terribly," she confessed one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "I miss my mother's laugh and the way my father would read to me from his books. When they died, it felt like the whole world went dark." Kieran reached out and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond the necessities of helping her on and off her horse. Her fingers were small in his, calloused now from work but still delicate. "I am sorry you lost them," he said, "but I am grateful that you are here." She looked at him, and in the fading light her eyes were luminous. "So am I," she whispered. A month after their marriage, Kieran's neighbors began to visit, curious about the new Mrs. Holloway. First came Tom and Elizabeth Patterson, who had a spread to the north. Elizabeth was a cheerful woman in her 40s who had raised 6 children on the frontier, and she took an immediate liking to Molly. "It is about time Kieran found himself a wife," she declared, settling into the kitchen chair that Molly offered. "We were beginning to worry he would turn into one of those old bachelor hermits." Kieran rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. "I am 26, Elizabeth, hardly ancient." "Old enough," Elizabeth said firmly. She turned to Molly. "How are you settling in, dear?" "Very well, thank you," Molly said. "Kieran has been very patient with me. I am still learning about ranch life, but I find I enjoy it." "She is being modest," Kieran interjected. "She has taken to everything like she was born to it." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Molly felt warmth spread through her chest. Over the past weeks, she had been falling in love with her husband, though she had not dared to say so. She did not know if Kieran felt the same way. He was kind to her, considerate and respectful, but he had not tried to move their relationship beyond companionship. They still slept in separate bedrooms, and while part of her was grateful for his restraint, another part of her longed for more. Other neighbors came in the following days. There were the Murphy brothers, Irish twins who ran cattle on the land to the west, and old Jacob Yates, who had been in Texas since before it was a state and had stories that could fill a book. They all welcomed Molly warmly, and she began to understand that she was part of a community now, not just a hired maid or a temporary visitor. She belonged here. The first real test of their partnership came in late May, when a violent storm rolled across the plains. Kieran had been watching the sky all afternoon, noting the strange greenish tint to the clouds and the way the wind had picked up. By evening, he was convinced they were in for serious weather. "We need to get the horses into the barn," he told Molly, "and make sure everything is secured. This is going to be bad." They worked together as the wind howled around them, leading the horses to safety and battening down anything that might blow away. The first drops of rain were falling when they finally made it back to the house, and within minutes, it was a deluge. Thunder cracked overhead like artillery, and lightning illuminated the world in brief, brilliant flashes. Molly stood at the window, watching the storm with wide eyes. She had seen storms before, but there was something about the raw power of a Texas thunderstorm that was both terrifying and magnificent. "Come away from the window," Kieran said, gently pulling her back. "Lightning can be unpredictable." They sat together by the fireplace, listening to the storm rage outside. At one point, a tremendous crash made Molly jump, and Kieran instinctively put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and they stayed that way for a long time, drawing comfort from each other's presence. "I have never been in a storm like this," Molly said. "They come through every spring. You get used to them." "I am not sure I want to get used to them. I would rather they stayed frightening and remarkable." Kieran smiled at that. "You have an interesting way of looking at the world, Molly Holloway." She turned her head to look at him, and suddenly they were very close. Kieran could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. For a moment, he thought about closing the distance between them, about finally kissing his wife properly. But then another crash of thunder made the house shake, and the moment passed. The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning. When it finally cleared, They emerged to find that one of the old cottonwood trees near the house had been struck by lightning and split down the middle. Several sections of fence had been damaged, and the creek that ran through Kieran's property was swollen and muddy. "It could have been worse," Kieran said, surveying the damage. "We will need to repair the fences before the cattle wander off, but everything else can wait." Molly rolled up her sleeves. "Tell me what to do." They spent the next 3 days working on repairs. Molly proved to be surprisingly handy with tools, and Kieran found himself relying on her more and more. They worked side by side in the sun, and by the end of each day, they were both exhausted and filthy and happy. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they were finishing the last section of fence, Molly paused and looked at Kieran. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course. When I got on that wagon in Missouri, I was terrified. I thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I thought you would take one look at me and send me away, or worse, that you would keep me out of obligation and resent me forever." She wiped her dirty hands on her skirt. "But this past month has been the happiest I have been since my parents died. I feel like I have found a home again. I feel like I have found a purpose, and I wanted you to know that I am grateful, more grateful than I can ever express." Kieran set down his tools and walked over to her. "Molly, I need you to know something too. When you showed up on my porch instead of Martha Whitfield, I made a decision based on practicality. I needed a wife, and you needed a home. But somewhere along the way, that changed for me. You have changed everything for me. I find myself thinking about you when I am supposed to be working. I find myself hurrying back to the house just to hear your voice. I have been trying to be respectful, trying to give you time to adjust to this life, but the truth is that I am falling in love with you. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day you arrived." Molly's breath caught in her throat. "Kieran, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know." "I do have to say something," Molly replied, stepping closer to him. "I have to tell you that I feel the same way. I have been in love with you for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. I was afraid you would think I was just being grateful or that I was trying to secure my position. But it is more than that. You are kind and strong and honorable, and you make me feel safe and valued and seen. I love you, Kieran Holloway. I love you with my whole heart." This time, when Kieran leaned in to kiss her, there was no hesitation. His lips met hers softly at first, tentatively, and then with growing confidence as she kissed him back. It was not their first kiss, but it was their first real kiss, the first one that meant everything. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. "I think we should probably head back to the house," Kieran said, his voice rough. "I think that is a very good idea," Molly agreed. That night, their marriage became a true marriage in every sense of the word. Kieran was gentle with Molly, patient and careful, and she felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay together in Kieran's bed, which was now their bed, and talked until the early hours of the morning. "I never thought I would have this," Molly said, her head resting on Kieran's chest. "A husband who loves me, a home of my own, a real life." "I never thought I would have it either," Kieran admitted. "I thought I would have a practical arrangement at best. Instead, I have you." "Do you ever think about Martha Whitfield?" Molly asked. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she had come instead of me?" Kieran was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, no. I think things worked out exactly the way they were supposed to. Martha did me a favor when she sent you in her place. She gave me something far more precious than she ever could have been." The summer of 1878 brought long, hot days and the constant work of maintaining the ranch. Molly threw herself into ranch life with determination. She learned to identify different cattle breeds and understand their health needs. She helped Kieran with the branding when it came time, though the smell and the sound of the calves made her stomach turn. She learned to shoot, practicing with Kieran's rifle until she could hit a target at 50 yards. "You are a natural," Kieran said, watching her. "Better than I was when I started." "I have a good teacher," Molly replied, leaning the rifle against the fence. "Besides, you said every rancher's wife should know how to protect herself and her property." "I did say that, though I hope you never have to use it for real." "So do I." The garden Molly had planted flourished in the Texas heat. She spent her mornings tending to it, and soon they had more vegetables than they could eat themselves. She began preserving food for the winter, filling jars with pickles and tomatoes and beans. She baked bread every other day, and the smell of it filled the house and made it feel even more like a home. In July, Elizabeth Patterson came calling with news. "We are having a dance in Johnson City next Saturday," she announced. "The whole community will be there. You two should come." Kieran looked at Molly, who nodded eagerly. "We would love to," he said. The dance was held in the largest barn in town, which had been cleared out and decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. It seemed like everyone from 50 miles around had come. There was a band made up of local men playing fiddles and guitars, and long tables laden with food that the women had brought. Molly wore the best dress she owned, a blue cotton gown that she had carefully mended and pressed. Kieran had never seen her look more beautiful. They danced together, spinning around the floor while the music played, and Kieran could not remember ever being happier. Between dances, they mingled with their neighbors. Molly found herself talking with several other ranch wives, sharing recipes and gardening tips. Kieran stood with the men, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns. But they kept finding their way back to each other, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Late in the evening, when the dancing had slowed and couples were swaying together to a gentle waltz, Kieran pulled Molly close. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. "Are you?" "More than I can say." They stayed until the very end of the dance and then rode home under a sky full of stars. The night air was cool and sweet, and Molly leaned against Kieran as they rode, feeling completely content. August brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the grass brown. The cattle grew listless, seeking shade wherever they could find it. Kieran and Molly worked to ensure the water sources did not dry up, spending long days hauling water and maintaining the wells. It was during this time that Molly realized something was different. She had missed her monthly courses, and she was feeling queasy in the mornings. At first, she thought it was the heat or something she had eaten, but as the days passed, she became more certain. She was carrying Kieran's child. She told him one evening as they sat on the porch, trying to catch any hint of a breeze. "Kieran, I have something to tell you," she said, her voice nervous. He turned to her, concern flickering across his face. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "No, I am perfectly well. In fact, I am more than well." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. In the spring, I think." For a moment, Kieran just stared at her, and Molly felt a flutter of fear. But then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he pulled her into his arms, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Molly asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Kieran said. He kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips. "You have given me everything, Molly, everything I never knew I needed." They told Elizabeth Patterson first, and she was delighted. "A baby! Oh, how wonderful! I will help you with everything, dear. You just let me know what you need." Word spread quickly through the community, as it always did, and soon they were receiving congratulations from all their neighbors. Jacob Yates carved a beautiful cradle from oak wood and brought it to them as a gift. The Murphy brothers promised to help Kieran with any heavy work as Molly's pregnancy progressed. As the months passed, Molly's belly grew round, and Kieran found himself more protective than ever. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too hard in the garden. Molly protested at first, insisting she was not fragile, but secretly she loved his attentiveness. The autumn of 1878 was mild and pleasant. The cattle were driven to market in Fort Worth, and Kieran returned with a good profit and gifts for Molly, including a beautiful shawl and a set of knitting needles, so she could make things for the baby. Winter came gently to central Texas that year, with only a few cold snaps and no snow. Molly spent her days preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes and arranging the nursery in what had been her original bedroom. Kieran added a rocking chair he had made himself, working on it in the barn during the evenings and presenting it to her on Christmas morning. "It is perfect," Molly said, running her hands over the smooth wood. She sat down in it, rocking gently, and smiled up at him. "Our baby will love this." "I hope so," Kieran said. He knelt beside the chair and placed his hand on her swollen belly. The baby kicked and he laughed. "Strong already." "Just like his father," Molly said. "Or her mother," Kieran countered. As the new year of 1879 began, Molly grew increasingly uncomfortable. Her back ached, and she could not sleep well. Kieran would rub her feet in the evenings and read to her from the newspapers he brought back from town. He was unfailingly patient and kind, even when she grew irritable from discomfort. In early March, on a warm afternoon when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, Molly's labor began. Kieran rode hard to fetch Elizabeth Patterson, who had helped birth half the babies in the county, and then he paced the floor while the older woman tended to his wife. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day. Kieran could hear Molly's cries from the other room, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand, but Elizabeth had shooed him out, saying he would just be in the way. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, he heard a new sound. A baby's cry, strong and lusty. A few minutes later, Elizabeth emerged from the bedroom, wiping her hands on her apron and grinning. "You have a son," she said. "A fine, healthy boy, and Molly is doing well, though she is exhausted. You can go in and see them now." Kieran did not need to be told twice. He rushed into the bedroom and found Molly propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face glowing. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Kieran approached slowly, almost reverently. Molly pulled back the blanket so he could see the baby's face. He was red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on this new world he had entered. "He is perfect," Kieran whispered. He sat down on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off his son. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Molly asked. They had discussed names before, but had not settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Kieran thought of his father, who despite all his bitterness had taught Kieran the value of hard work and perseverance. But he also thought of Molly's father, the schoolteacher who had filled his daughter's head with stories and dreams. "What was your father's name?" he asked. "Thomas Chambers." "Then we should call him Thomas Kieran Holloway." Molly's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" "Name him after my father." "Your father helped make you who you are," Kieran said, "and you are the best thing that ever happened to me. It seems fitting." They called the baby Thomas, and from the moment he entered the world, he brought nothing but joy. He was a good baby, sleeping well and eating heartily. Molly recovered quickly from the birth, and soon she was back to managing the household, though now with an infant on her hip. Kieran was besotted with his son. He would hold him for hours, talking to him about the ranch and the cattle and all the things they would do together when Thomas was older. Molly would watch them together, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The spring of 1879 passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. But even in their exhaustion, Kieran and Molly were happy. Their little family felt complete, their home filled with love and laughter. In May, they took Thomas to his first dance in Johnson City. He slept through most of it, bundled in a basket that Molly kept close by. Their neighbors cooed over him, and Elizabeth Patterson declared him the finest baby she had ever seen. "You two did good work," she said, beaming at them. "Real good work." As summer arrived and Thomas grew stronger and more alert, Kieran began teaching Molly more about the business side of ranching. He showed her the account books and explained how he tracked expenses and profits. He took her with him when he met with buyers, wanting her to understand every aspect of their livelihood. "This ranch belongs to both of us," he said. "You should know how everything works." Molly was a quick study, and soon she was offering suggestions that Kieran had not considered. She had a head for numbers that surprised them both, and she found ways to economize without sacrificing quality. "You are going to make us rich," Kieran joked one evening as they went over the books together. "I am going to make us secure," Molly corrected. "I never want Thomas to worry about having enough, the way I did after my parents died." Kieran understood. He never wanted that either. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, he was a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and laughed at the simplest things. Kieran would hold him up on his horse, letting him feel the motion and the wind, and Thomas would squeal with delight. Molly worried it was too dangerous, but Kieran was always careful, and she had to admit that their son seemed to love it. The autumn of 1879 brought another successful cattle drive, and more profit than they had seen yet. Kieran used some of the money to buy more land, expanding their ranch. He also purchased a milk cow so that Molly could make butter and cheese, which she could sell in town for extra income. "We are doing well," Kieran said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas toddle around on unsteady legs. He was 10 months old now and determined to walk, though he fell down more often than not. "We are," Molly agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed. Do you ever regret it?" "Agreeing to marry me that first day," Molly looked at him, surprised by the question. "Never, not for a single moment. Do you regret choosing me over sending me away?" "Never," Kieran echoed. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You were the right bride all along. I think fate knew that, even if we did not." As 1880 dawned, the Holloway Ranch was thriving. They had expanded their herd and their land, and they had built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Kieran had become a respected member of the ranching community, and Molly was known for her kindness and her skill at managing a household. Thomas celebrated his first birthday in March with a small party attended by their neighbors. He smashed his hands into the cake Molly had made and got frosting everywhere, and everyone laughed at his delight. He was walking confidently now and talking in simple words. Kieran swore his first word had been Papa, though Molly insisted it had been Mama. In the summer of 1880, Molly discovered she was pregnant again. She told Kieran while they were working in the garden together, and he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, making her laugh and scold him at the same time. "You will hurt yourself," she protested. "I am too happy to hurt myself," Kieran replied, setting her down gently and kissing her soundly. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Molly knew what to expect. She continued her work on the ranch, though Kieran insisted she take more breaks and not push herself too hard. Thomas was a handful, always getting into things and requiring constant supervision, but he brought such joy to their lives that neither of them minded. In February of 1881, Molly gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Rose, after Kieran's mother who had died when he was young. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with Molly's auburn hair and Kieran's dark eyes. Kieran held her with trembling hands, overcome with emotion. "2 children," he said, his voice thick. "We have 2 beautiful children. We are blessed," Molly agreed, watching him with their daughter. Thomas, now nearly 2, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would bring her his toys and try to share his food with her. Kieran and Molly had to watch him carefully to make sure he did not accidentally hurt her with his enthusiastic affection, but it was clear he adored her. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch continued to prosper, and Kieran was able to hire a couple of hands to help with the heavy work. This gave him more time to spend with his family, which was what he wanted most. They added onto the house, building another bedroom and a larger kitchen. Molly planted fruit trees and expanded her garden. She kept chickens now and sold eggs in town. She had become friends with many of the women in the community, and they would gather regularly to sew and talk and share their lives. Thomas grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere. By the time he was 4, he could sit a horse by himself and help with simple chores. Catherine was quieter, more thoughtful, but she had a will of iron when she wanted something. Molly often said she got that from her father. In the spring of 1883, when Thomas was 4 and Catherine was 2, Molly found herself pregnant for a 3rd time. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, and she was often tired and unwell. Kieran worried constantly, but Molly insisted she was fine. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time," she reminded him. "I am strong and I have Elizabeth to help me. Everything will be all right." In November of 1883, Molly went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected. Kieran rode for Elizabeth in a panic, and the older woman came as quickly as she could. But the labor was fast and hard, and by the time Elizabeth arrived, Molly had already given birth to twins. 2 more sons, identical in every way, with Molly's green eyes and loud, healthy lungs. "Twins," Kieran said, looking from one baby to the other in complete shock. "We have twins." "We do," Molly said, exhausted but smiling. "I think we should name them after their grandfathers, James Thomas after your father and Daniel Frederick after mine." Kieran could not speak. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and their 2 new sons. They had 4 children now. 4 healthy, beautiful children, and a wife he loved more with each passing day. Life with 4 children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. The house was never quiet, and there was always someone needing something. But Kieran and Molly had help now, both from their hired hands and from their neighbors. Elizabeth Patterson was like a grandmother to the children, and the Murphy brothers never came to visit without bringing gifts. Thomas took his role as oldest child seriously, helping his mother with his younger siblings and trying to do ranch work like his father. Catherine was the princess of the household, adored by her brothers and wrapped around her father's finger. The twins, James and Daniel, were mischievous and inseparable, getting into constant trouble but charming their way out of it. As the 1880s progressed, Kieran and Molly watched their children grow and their ranch flourish. They had built something lasting, something meaningful. The wrong bride had shown up on Kieran's doorstep 6 years ago, and he had married her anyway. It was the best decision he had ever made. One evening in the summer of 1885, when Thomas was 6, Catherine was 4, and the twins were 18 months old, Kieran and Molly managed to steal a few moments alone on the porch. The children were all asleep inside, worn out from a day of playing. The Texas sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the air was warm and still. "You remember the day we met?" Molly asked, leaning her head on Kieran's shoulder. "Every detail," Kieran replied. "You looked so scared standing on my porch, I almost sent you away." "What made you change your mind? Honestly, I do not know. Instinct maybe, or fate. I just knew that sending you away would be the biggest mistake of my life." "I am glad you listened to your instinct," Molly said. She turned to look at him, her eyes soft with love. "These past years with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I would never have it. You gave me a family and a purpose and a life worth living. I love you, Kieran Holloway. I will love you until the day I die and beyond." Kieran pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and passion he felt. "And I love you, Molly Holloway. You were the right bride all along. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to be yours." They sat together as the sun set. Two people who had found each other through chance and choice, who had built a life together through hard work and love. They had 4 children sleeping safely inside their home, a prosperous ranch spreading out around them, and a future full of promise. The wrong bride had shown up at his door, and the cowboy had married her anyway. And he had never looked back, not once, because looking back would mean looking away from the best thing that had ever happened to him. Molly was his partner, his love, his everything, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. They had each other, and that was all they would ever need. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. By 1888, Thomas was 9 years old and already a capable ranch hand, working alongside his father with pride. Catherine was 7 and had started attending the small school that had been built in Johnson City. She loved learning, reading every book she could get her hands on, and Molly thought often of her father, the school teacher, seeing his legacy in his granddaughter. The twins, James and Daniel, were 4 now and absolutely inseparable. They had their own language that only they seemed to understand, and they could communicate with just a look. They were clever and curious, always asking questions and exploring their world with fearless abandon. Kieran had built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the area. He employed 5 full-time hands now, good men who treated the Holloway family with respect and loyalty. The cattle herd had grown to over 500 head, and Kieran was experimenting with different breeding techniques to improve quality. Molly had become a fixture in the Johnson City community. She organized church socials and helped new families settle into the area. She taught other women how to preserve food and manage household accounts. She had become the person others turned to for advice and support, and she wore that responsibility with grace. But despite their success and the busyness of their lives, Kieran and Molly always made time for each other. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when they could, talking about their day and making plans for the future. They still stole kisses in the barn when the children were not watching. They still looked at each other across the dinner table and felt their hearts swell with love. In the fall of 1888, a traveling photographer came through Johnson City, and Kieran surprised Molly by arranging for a family portrait. They dressed in their best clothes and went to town, where the photographer had set up his equipment. Getting 4 children to sit still long enough for a photograph was a challenge, but they managed it. In the resulting image, Kieran and Molly sat in chairs with Catherine standing between them. Thomas stood behind his father's shoulder, trying to look grown up. The twins sat on the floor in front, and miracle of miracles, they were both looking at the camera and neither was making a face. When the photograph was developed and framed, Molly hung it in the parlor where she could see it every day. She loved looking at the evidence of the life they had built together. Sometimes she could hardly believe this was her family, her home, her reality. In 1890, tragedy struck the community when Jacob Yates passed away in his sleep at the age of 78. The old man had been a friend and mentor to Kieran, and his death hit hard. At the funeral, Kieran stood with his children and spoke about what Jacob had meant to him. "He taught me that being a good rancher is about more than raising cattle," Kieran said, his voice steady despite his grief. "It is about being a good neighbor, a good friend, a good man. He taught me that land is not just property to be owned, but a trust to be cared for. I will miss him every day, but I will honor his memory by trying to be the kind of man he was." Thomas, now 11, stood tall beside his father, and Kieran could see tears in his son's eyes. Jacob had carved toys for all the children, and they had loved him dearly. It was their first real experience with death, and it was hard. That evening, Molly held Catherine while she cried, and Kieran sat with the boys, answering their questions about death and heaven and what happens when people die. It was a hard conversation, but an important one, and they got through it together. As the 1890s began, the Holloway children continued to grow and change. Thomas was becoming a young man, tall and strong like his father, with a natural way with horses that impressed everyone who saw him work. He was 13 now, and already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Catherine was 11, and beautiful in a way that made Kieran nervous. She had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, and a sharp intelligence that sometimes surprised people. She wanted to be a teacher like her grandfather had been, and Molly and Kieran both encouraged her dreams. The twins were 7, and while they were still inseparable, their individual personalities were becoming clearer. James was the more cautious of the two, thoughtful and precise in everything he did. Daniel was the adventurer, always ready to try something new and never worried about the consequences. In the spring of 1892, Molly discovered she was pregnant again. She was 36 now and had not expected to have another child. When she told Kieran, his reaction was mixed. He was happy, of course, but also worried. Women died in childbirth all the time, and at Molly's age the risks were higher. "I will be fine," Molly assured him. "I have had 4 successful pregnancies. I am strong and healthy, and Elizabeth has promised to be with me every step of the way." Kieran held her close, his heart full of both joy and fear. "I could not bear to lose you," he said quietly. "You will not lose me," Molly promised. "I have far too much to live for." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Molly tired more easily than she had with the others. The children were excited about having a new sibling, though the twins declared they hoped it was a brother because they already had enough sisters. In December of 1892, on a cold but clear day, Molly gave birth to their 5th child. It was an easier labor than she had expected, and when it was over, she held a tiny daughter with Kieran's dark hair and her own delicate features. "What should we name her?" Kieran asked, holding Molly's hand. Molly thought for a moment. They had used family names for all the others, but this little one deserved something special. "Grace," she said finally. "Grace Elizabeth, after Elizabeth Patterson, who has been like a mother to me all these years." When they told Elizabeth, the older woman wept with joy. "I am honored," she said, holding baby Grace with experienced hands. "Truly honored." Grace completed their family. At 14, Thomas was old enough to be protective of his baby sister. Catherine, at 12, loved having another girl in the house. The twins, at 8, were surprisingly gentle with the baby, bringing her wildflowers and trying to make her laugh. As Grace grew, It became clear she was going to be the baby of the family in more than just age. She was sweet and gentle, quick to laugh and slow to anger. She loved everyone and everything, and she brought a special kind of joy to the household. The years of the mid-1890s were good ones for the Holloway family. The ranch continued to prosper, and Kieran was able to save enough money to ensure all his children would have opportunities he had never had. Thomas was being groomed to take over the ranch, but Kieran made sure all his children knew they had choices. "This ranch will be here if you want it," he told them. "But if you want something different, something more, I will support that too. Your mother and I want you to be happy, whatever that means for you." In 1896, when Thomas was 17, he fell in love with a girl from Johnson City named Sarah Bennett. She was the daughter of the general store owner, a sweet girl with a good head on her shoulders. Thomas courted her properly, and by Christmas of that year, he asked Kieran's permission to marry her. "You are young yet," Kieran said, "but I was not much older when I married your mother, and if you love Sarah the way I love your mother, then you have my blessing." They were married in the spring of 1897, in a ceremony that brought tears to Molly's eyes. Her firstborn son was now a married man, starting a life of his own. Thomas and Sarah built a small house on the ranch property, and Thomas continued to work alongside his father. Catherine, now 15, had been accepted to a teaching college in Austin. It was a 2-day journey from Johnson City, and the thought of her leaving was hard for both Kieran and Molly. But they knew it was what she wanted, and they would not hold her back. "I will come home for visits," Catherine promised, "and I will write every week, but I need to do this. I need to see what I am capable of." "I know," Molly said, holding her daughter close, "and I am so proud of you, so very proud." The twins were 12 now, and already showing interest in different aspects of ranching. James loved the business side, asking to see the account books and learning about breeding and markets. Daniel preferred the hands-on work, spending hours working with the horses and cattle. Grace was 4, a bright-eyed little girl who followed her siblings around and tried to do everything they did. She was fearless in a way that terrified Kieran, climbing trees and riding horses far too fast. Molly just laughed and said she reminded her of someone. "Who?" Kieran asked. "You," Molly replied. "She has your spirit." In the fall of 1897, Kieran and Molly celebrated their 19th anniversary. 19 years since that day when the wrong bride had shown up on his porch. 19 years of love and laughter, hard work and harder times, joy and sorrow and everything in between. They had a small celebration, just the two of them, leaving the children with Elizabeth for the evening. They rode out to a spot on the ranch that had always been special to them, a hilltop where they could see for miles in every direction. 19 years, Molly said, leaning against Kieran as they watched the sun set. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "I would not change a single day of it," Kieran said. "Well, maybe a few of the days when the twins got into trouble," Molly laughed. "They were not that bad. They let all the chickens out and it took us 3 days to round them up." "All right, maybe that day I would change," Molly admitted. She turned to look at Kieran, her eyes serious now. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for seeing something in me that day that made you willing to take a chance. Thank you for being brave enough to get on that wagon in Missouri," Kieran replied. "Thank you for trusting me with your life and your heart. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, two people still completely in love after 19 years of marriage. As the century drew to a close, the Holloway family faced changes and challenges. In 1898, Sarah gave birth to Kieran and Molly's first grandchild, a boy they named Michael. Holding his grandson for the first time, Kieran felt the weight of time and legacy in a new way. This child represented the future, the continuation of everything he and Molly had built. Catherine graduated from college in 1899 and took a teaching position in Johnson City, much to everyone's relief. She had grown into a confident, capable young woman, and Molly could not have been prouder. Catherine met a young lawyer in town named David Morris, and they began courting. The twins were 14 now, and had grown into handsome young men who were still best friends. James had a natural gift for mathematics and business, and Kieran had begun teaching him about investments and financial planning. Daniel was the best horseman Kieran had ever seen, with an almost magical ability to work with even the most difficult animals. Grace was 7 and had started school. She was a bright student, though she would rather be outside than sitting at a desk. She loved the ranch and everything about it, and Kieran suspected she would be the one who never left. In the summer of 1900, as the new century dawned, Kieran organized a huge celebration on the ranch. All their neighbors came, along with friends from town and family members. There was food and music and dancing, and as Kieran looked around at the gathering, he felt overwhelming gratitude. He found Molly in the crowd and pulled her aside. "Look at what we have built," he said, gesturing to the celebration, the ranch, the life they had created. "All of this started because you had the courage to show up on my porch when you were not the bride I expected. And you had the wisdom to see that sometimes the unexpected can be the best gift of all," Molly replied. They danced together as the sun set, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, their friends and neighbors. And as they moved together to the music, Kieran thought about that day 22 years ago when Molly had stepped down from that wagon. He thought about all the moments since then, the big ones and the small ones, the joys and the sorrows. He had married the wrong bride, and it had turned out to be the most right decision of his life. The early years of the new century brought more changes. In 1901, Catherine married David Morris in a beautiful ceremony in the Johnson City Church. Molly cried through the entire service, happy tears for her daughter but sad ones too, because it meant another child was leaving to build a life of their own. Thomas and Sarah had their second child in 1902, a daughter they named Emma. The twins turned 16 and began taking on more responsibility on the ranch, each working in the areas they loved most. Grace was 9 now, and had asked for her own horse, which Kieran gladly provided. In the spring of 1903, Kieran woke one morning with a pain in his chest. He did not mention it to Molly, not wanting to worry her, but as the day went on, the pain persisted. By evening, he could not hide it anymore, and Molly insisted on sending for the doctor. Dr. Harrison, who had taken over the practice from the elderly physician who had served Johnson City for decades, examined Kieran carefully. "Your heart is strong," he said finally, "but you are not a young man anymore, Kieran. You are 48 years old and you have been working hard your entire life. You need to slow down, let your sons take on more of the work." Kieran wanted to argue, but the concern in Molly's eyes stopped him. "I will slow down," he promised. "I have good help. I can delegate more." Over the following months, Kieran did exactly that. Thomas essentially ran the day-to-day operations of the ranch now, with help from James and Daniel. Kieran still worked, but he focused more on planning and oversight, letting the younger men handle the physical labor. It was hard at first, stepping back from the work that had defined him for so long. But it also gave him more time with Molly and with Grace, who was still young enough to want her father's attention. They would ride together in the afternoons, father and daughter, exploring the ranch and talking about everything and nothing. In 1904, James announced he wanted to go to college to study business and agriculture. At 17, he was ready for the challenge, and Kieran fully supported him. Daniel, meanwhile, had no interest in leaving the ranch. He was happy working with the horses and cattle, and Kieran knew he would be an asset to the family operation for years to come. Grace was 11 now, and had grown into a beautiful girl with her father's determination and her mother's kindness. She had declared she was never getting married, that she was going to stay on the ranch forever and help run it with her brothers. Molly and Kieran just smiled, knowing that her opinions might change as she got older, but loving her certainty nonetheless. In the fall of 1905, Kieran and Molly celebrated their 27th anniversary. They were in their late 40s now, their hair showing gray, their hands marked by decades of work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been when they first met. 27 years, Kieran said as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. It was their tradition now, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Sometimes I still cannot believe you stayed. Where else would I go? Molly asked. You are my home, Kieran. You always have been. I love you, Kieran said, taking her hand. More now than even in the beginning, if that is possible. It is possible, Molly replied, because I feel the same way. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, hearts beating in rhythm with each other. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. In the house behind them, Grace was practicing her piano. In the distance, they could hear Daniel working with a horse. Thomas and Sarah's children were playing in their yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. This was what they had built together. Not just a ranch or a business, but a legacy. A family. A life filled with love and purpose and meaning. The wrong bride had shown up at Kieran Holloway's door 27 years ago, and he had married her anyway. And he had never looked back, not once, because every moment since then had confirmed that she was exactly who he was meant to find. As the years continued to unfold, the Holloway family remained strong. Thomas and Sarah had 4 children now, and were talking about building a larger house. Catherine and David had moved to Austin, where David had been offered a position with a prestigious law firm, and Catherine had opened a school for girls. James graduated from college and returned to the ranch with innovative ideas about breeding and land management. Daniel married a neighboring rancher's daughter named Lisa, and they built a home on the ranch property. Grace, true to her childhood declaration, showed no interest in leaving, instead throwing herself into every aspect of ranch life. In 1910, when Grace was 18, she fell in love with a young veterinarian named Peter Walsh, who had recently opened a practice in Johnson City. He was a kind man who shared her love of animals, and Kieran and Molly approved wholeheartedly. I thought you said you were never getting married, Kieran teased his youngest daughter. I changed my mind, Grace replied, her eyes shining. But we are going to live on the ranch, Papa. Peter is going to build a practice here. I am still not leaving you. Grace and Peter were married in the spring of 1911, in a ceremony that brought together 3 generations of Holloways. Kieran watched his youngest daughter walk down the aisle and thought about the passage of time, about how quickly it all went. That evening, after the celebration had ended and most of the guests had gone home, Kieran and Molly sat on their porch once again. They were both 56 now, their children all grown and starting families of their own. We did well, Molly said softly. 5 children, all happy and healthy and living good lives, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a ranch that will provide for generations. We did very well indeed. We did, Kieran agreed, and we did it together. He thought about that day 33 years ago, when Molly had stepped down from that wagon and changed his life forever. He thought about all the moments since then, the tapestry of their life together, woven from thousands of small threads. every conversation, every shared meal, every laugh and tear and triumph and challenge. All of it had brought them here to this moment, to this life they had built. "I would do it all again," Kieran said. "Every single moment. I would choose you every time." "And I would choose you," Molly replied. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the stars came out. Two people who had found each other through chance and luck and fate, and had made the most of every day they had been given. The wrong bride had shown up at his door, and the cowboy had married her anyway. And in doing so, he had found not just a wife, but a partner, a best friend, a love that would last a lifetime and beyond. He had found his home, his heart, his everything. And he had never, not for one single moment, looked back. Years later, when Kieran was 72 and Molly was 70, they still sat on that porch every evening, hands linked, hearts full. Their children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The ranch was run by Thomas now, with help from his brothers and his own grown children. But Kieran and Molly were still there, still together, still deeply in love after 46 years of marriage. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Molly turned to Kieran and said, "Do you remember what you told me on our wedding night? You said you thought things worked out exactly the way they were supposed to." "I remember," Kieran said. "And I was right, was I not?" "You were absolutely right," Molly agreed. "Martha Whitfield did us both a favor when she sent me in her place. She gave us each other, and that has made all the difference." Kieran lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You have been my greatest blessing, Molly Holloway, my greatest adventure, my greatest love." "And you have been mine," Molly said, tears shimmering in her still green eyes. "Every single day you have been mine." As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in perfect contentment. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and had built a beautiful life together. The wrong bride had become the right wife, and their love story had become the stuff of family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a love story that began with uncertainty and fear, but grew into something powerful and unshakable. It was a love story that weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. It was a love story that proved sometimes the unexpected can be the greatest gift of all. And it was a love story that would last forever, long after Kieran and Molly were gone, living on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch they had built together, in the legacy of love they left behind. The wrong bride showed up at his door. The cowboy married her anyway, and he never looked back, because looking back would have meant missing the incredible journey forward, the beautiful life they built together, the love that defined them both, and that love was worth everything. Worth the risk, worth the uncertainty, worth every challenge they faced. Because in the end, it was not about being the right bride or the expected bride. It was about being the bride who showed up, who stayed, who worked alongside him to build something real and lasting and true. Molly had been that bride, and Kieran had been wise enough, brave enough, and lucky enough to recognize it from the very first day. That recognition, that choice, that leap of faith, had given them both more than they ever dreamed possible. As they sat together on their porch, in the home they had made, surrounded by the evidence of their love, they knew they had been blessed beyond measure. The wrong bride had turned out to be exactly right, and their love story would continue to inspire and guide their family for generations to come. This was their happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished. This was the life they had chosen, the love they had nurtured, the legacy they would leave. And it all began with a young woman standing on a porch, afraid but hopeful, and a cowboy who looked past his expectations to see what was really standing in front of him. The best decision either of them ever made. The beginning of everything that mattered. The start of a love that would never end.